Welcome to the Neja Chuan podcast. My name is Isaac Kamens. This is a bi-weekly podcast where my friend Jess O'Brien and I discuss internal martial arts, Qigong, and meditation. This episode, we discuss a 1993 Pa Kua Journal issue, which focuses on Luo De Xiu. So we talk about Luo's early training at the Tang Shu Dao with Hung Yishang, and a little bit about his later training. And in the Patreon episode, we continue our look at the Taiwan Wulin article by Luo, where he discusses his grand teacher, Zhang Feng. He gets into more about the Yizhong system and the training that Zhang developed in his early days in Taiwan, and sort of how it developed into what is now the Tang Shu Dao. All right, hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for supporting us. Take care of yourselves and be well.
This season, we've been discussing the Chinese martial arts of Taiwan. Obviously, Master Hung Yishang, has been our focus so far. It's been fun to dig into some of the stuff written by Marcus Brinkman and Bob Yu, and also about his well-known student, Sudong Chen. So today, we're going to look at another student of Master Hung Yishang, Luo De Xiu, who's spent a lot of time traveling the world teaching this Yizhong method. And Luo is been in a number of magazines and books, so there's some stuff about him. And so we wanted to start by looking at Pa Kua Journal. Has a fantastic profile of Luo from, let's see here, July 1993. And that's when Luo was first starting to come around to the States, sponsored by Vince Black's North American Tang Shu Dao, and then later by other teachers who kept bringing him back. And he's had, quite a number of different schools across the USA sponsor him. And somebody, if you get a chance to check out, definitely want to see. I think he's one of the best, and I've enjoyed training with him over the years. I first got to train with him in 2000 in Berkeley, and then he kept coming every summer or fall up until 2019. So let's get into this profile and learn a little bit more about Luo De Xiu. So Dan Miller writes, Luo De Xiu started his martial arts training in 1968, studying Shaolin from a few of his relatives. When he was in 8th grade, a classmate named Su was studying at Hung Yishang School and showed Luo what he had been learning. Luo was interested in what he saw, so he and a few other classmates went with Su to Hung Yishang School to check it out. After his initial introduction, Luo studied there for 3 or 4 months, but then dropped out because he didn't like the basic Tang Shu Dao training that Hung taught the beginners. Luo continued to practice on his own and would sometimes practice with his friend Sudong Chen. When Luo realized that the basic Tang Shu Dao training eventually led to the study of Xingyi Quan, he went back to study at Hung School. Luo started studying there for the second time in 1971. So that speaks to a lot of what we've been talking about Master Hung Yishang, how he had combined all the martial arts he knew into these beginner sets that we call the Tang Shu Dao system, that are designed to give you a basic martial arts foundation, and can lead eventually to learning the classical martial arts system. But I think a lot, there was a trend in the 60s and 70s, sort of like Bruce Lee, where you want to cut away the old-fashioned stuff and create a more streamlined, easy to learn system. And also, as we mentioned, Hung was teaching military guys going to Vietnam who didn't have time to learn a whole complicated old-fashioned martial arts system and needed to just get real basic combat training. So he was using this Tang Shu Dao system for that. And it sounds like young Luo De Xiu was put off by the grinding repetition of the sort of karate style training.
Yeah, it sounds like he didn't like the hard stuff that much. Or he had already done it, with if he'd done that Shaolin stuff, it was probably pretty similar to what he'd already done.
Right. So maybe it didn't seem too exciting and interesting. And I think Kumar Francis also had the same problem when he showed up, because he was like, as we described in the Patreon episodes, he came to Master Hung School and was very resistant to doing the basic
Well, I mean,
training
I
and
think,
just getting stuck
yeah,
doing those sets.
I think if you've already done like a Japanese martial arts or Shaolin or something, there's not going to be much in those, those Tang Shi Dao forms that, is different, right? It's the same type of movements, the same type of training.
Right. And that, as we mentioned too, like that Tang Shidao curriculum is pretty extensive. There's multiple of these 8-step sets. And then there's these sort of Shaolin sets that they do as well. And so there's a lot of work you have to do. When I was in Tang Shidao, it took me a year and a half to get through that before I even started on Xingyi.
Yeah.
So it's a bunch of work, and not that I mean I love it. I thought it was great, but at the same time, I could see where if you've already got experience in Shaolin, you'd probably want, and you're seeking internal martial arts, you're going to be a little impatient. So the article continues by saying that Hung Yishang had started his Tang Shudao school in the mid 60s. By the early 70s, martial arts were at their height of their popularity in Taiwan, and Hung School had about 200 students. So this must be the time period of the elementary school,
Right.
the Honglei Elementary School, where they had that giant gymnasium and that they were just, some of the other books are describing as just filled with people, fighting and training, and it was like this just total center of exciting martial
It
arts.
was the heyday of his school, I mean, where later it just was a smaller group,
Right.
this was the big time.
And it was just filled with brawlers just going off. So there was a lot of fighting, a lot of hard training, and just the type of heavy duty martial arts that a young fighter was looking for.
Yeah.
He says it was during this heyday that Lo eventually became one of Hong's top students and one of the best fighters of his generation. Dan writes that when I visited Hung Yishang at his school and asked about Lo, Hung said that Lo was a good fighter and pointed to a trophy he still has in the school's trophy case, which Lo had won for the school in a national tournament 20 years before. So that would be somewhere around 1973.
Right.
So that's pretty cool. His master at least gave him a compliment and said he was a good fighter.
Yeah.
You don't hear that very often. So the next, he talks about Lo's martial arts training. Lo started his tournament fighting career in 1972. Between 72 and 74, studying the martial arts in order to learn how to win fights became his main priority. Whenever he was taught something new, he immediately wanted to learn how it was applied to fighting. When Hung taught Xingyi, it was always in a fighting context. However, Lo wanted to try and really understand what techniques worked and why. And so he would ask his teacher many questions about everything that he was taught. Lo states that he and about 5 of the other students at Hung School spent most of their time investigating and practicing Xingyi, with fighting as the focus. Hung recognized Lo's love of fighting. When visitors from outside came to check out Hung's school and wanted to test his students' skill, Hung usually sent Lo out to fight with them. Lo states that he did well against many of these visitors. However, there were some that he had some problems with, so he knew he had to practice harder and continue to investigate the depths of his martial arts. Around 1974, in order to broaden his horizons, Lo began talking with other martial arts teachers around Taiwan. One of the first teachers he visited was Hung Yishang's brother, Hung Yimen. While at Hung Yishang's school, Lo had mostly studied Xingyi. When he met Hung Yimen, he began to learn more about other parts of Grandmaster Zhang Junfeng's system, especially the Ba Kua Journal. So
All right, well,
yeah,
hold on.
that's
Let's back
interesting.
up. Let's unpack
Yeah,
some of that. So the first thing I noticed, right, is the in the stuff we've been talking about on the Patreon with the blurred boundaries, the Hung Zihan is saying that it was always the sons, it was the sons who took the challenge or whatever.
right.
And it would sounds like maybe not.
Maybe not always. It sounds like Luo
Not
De
always.
Xiu was taking some of those challenges.
Yeah, and that sticks out a little bit.
Yeah, and I know
Um,
from conversations with Lo, like he's mentioned it sometimes, and the vibe is a little bit like, yeah, there are all these bigger, stronger guys than me, but they always made me go out and fight the visitors.
right.
So he's like, he got great experience out of that, but at the same time, he'd look around, hey, you guys are bigger and stronger. Why are you making me do the fighting? But in the long run,
Well,
it served him.
and I think that was a similar with Sudongshin as well too. Right?
Mm,
Hung would make him a challenge.
it's true. That was in Sudong Chen's article. He was saying the same thing pretty much, that he had multiple challenges that he had to take.
Sounds like Hung would have a favorite, guy that he would pick that would sort of be
Yeah,
the star for a little while, and then they'd move on and he'd pick someone else.
sure. And yeah, and it across the board, the guys who were in that position, it never sounded fun. Like I think as an outsider, you'd think, geez, I wish I was the school's star pupil and it'd be up to me to fight for the honor of the
Mm,
school. But
no
when you talk
thanks.
to the guys, it's like emotional. You're like, dude, I didn't want to fight these people. Like,
Uh,
that's, I wasn't looking for this.
yeah.
So there's two sides to
Well, I
that
mean,
story.
that's where I think some of it is that um, during this period, this was, that was the way that Hung Yisheng kept his reputation going, right? Was to have
Sure,
good fighters. And so he may have pressured them a little more than they wanted to um, perform well, you know?
totally. No, I can only imagine the stress of some brand new, big, tough karate guy showing up saying, "Hey, is the school any good?" And you're like, "Shit, now I gotta fight this guy." Like, but
Well,
again,
or that
that's
if,
how you get the experience.
if the Tang Dao is putting on a tournament, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't look good if you guys don't win your own tournament, right? So
Right.
you got to have some pretty good fighters.
Right.
That's the case,
And
and
then
I think
that reminds me of another thing Lo would say sometimes is that Master Hong was always stressed out at the tournaments. Like to him, losing would be a
it
huge
would be a
loss of
big
face.
thing.
Like
Yeah, yeah.
he was not unconcerned about his school losing this stuff. So
No,
he
I
was
mean,
very intense about getting them to win.
yeah. So yeah, it makes sense. But
And he mentioned another one that I recall was that Master Hong would just be smoking pack after pack of cigarettes. He's so stressed out. So
chain
he's like,
smoking.
yeah. So he'd light one cigarette off the
Yeah,
last one and chuck the butt and just start the next one right after the
yeah.
last one, just like a chimney. You gotta, you want, it's in Chinese martial arts, there's a lot of face involved. You want to make sure you're well represented when it comes to freestyle.
Yeah. So then the other thing is going to his brother is also kind of an interesting
Mm,
piece, right? Because that's not always, sometimes that's frowned upon to like go to a different family
that's
member.
kind of always frowned
Oh,
upon.
yeah, always, right?
I think in this case, it was very much frowned upon.
Well, it sounds like that in some ways there was a uh, bit of that sort of brotherly competition between the
Yeah.
two, and I've heard from some people that basically it was like an unwritten rule that if you
Hmm.
studied with one, you didn't really go and study with the other. Um, that it was just like that's not cool. Um,
Right. So they were breaking the rules a little bit to try and
right, right, right.
get more, always trying to get a little bit more and get that edge. So it says when Lo started at Hung School, he knew that Hung Yishang's teacher was named Zhang, but he did not know exactly who Zhang was. He said that he remembers seeing Zhang Zhenfeng walking around with a scowl on his face at the tournaments, but did not put two and two together until later. Once he learned exactly who Hung's teacher was, he began to search for other students of Zhang Zhenfeng. He discovered that among the group that had studied with Zhang the longest, the three Hung brothers were the ones who had studied the most and had continued to practice and teach. Although Lo was still studying at Hung school, he would frequently go to where Hung's brothers, Hung Men and Hung Wen, were teaching and ask questions. He became determined to piece together Zhang Zhenfeng's entire system. So that's the story that we've run across, over the years in our podcast. There's always the story of you learn from your master, but then you get interested. Well, who was his teacher, and who were the other guys that learned from his teacher? And that, we talked about Liu Hongjie, the old master that Kumar trained with in Beijing, who did the same thing. He jumped up to the generation before and tried to find those older guys to give him insights from that previous generation above his teacher. And Lowe did the same thing to find the classmates of his own teacher and sort of dig through their information and see if they could give him additional insights and pieces to help him figure out what he had already knew and add to it and help clarify the system. And we were reading Blurred Boundaries in some of those earlier episodes, and you get the impression Hung Yishang, the Xingyi master, is the more heavy set, the more
Oh yeah, no,
down to earth, kind of guy. His brother Hung Wen was the wiry, quick, speedy guy who did Bagua, who was of extremely hot temper. The older brother is always mad at feeling
right, right.
disrespected by the younger brothers.
Well, I mean,
And then Hung Wen, the Tai Chi guy, was he had the one who had the most schooling. So he had the
right, right.
more
He's the smart one.
philosophical approach that kind of suited his Tai Chi a little better.
Right, right. But there's a piece I think where that there are, in a sense, Xingyi body typed people and Bagua body typed people a little, and so there's a piece where, if you're of a certain shape and a certain size, you might be able to do all three, but your just natural kind of tendency might be towards one or the other, right? And
And personality too, maybe.
for sure, absolutely. Like, I mean, but like when I met Vince, he told me, and I have no idea what he meant by this, but he told me if I gained a few pounds, I'd have a Shingy body type. So, but
Hey,
I
good
don't.
advice.
But I think meaning that Shingy is a little more geared towards like holding your ground and smashing through stuff as
Little
opposed
extra, few extra pounds would help.
well, as opposed to Boggle, which is about getting out of the way of things, right? So if you're smaller, smaller stature, you're not gonna, as a rule, want to just stand there against a bigger opponent and try to
Sure.
duke it out with them, right? Getting out of the way makes a lot more sense, right? And then the other way around, if you are big, most of the time you can just kind of, sit there and just pound on someone and they can't really move you, so you're in good shape, right?
Right.
And and then there's the Tai Chi one, which is another kind of strategy too. But
Yeah. Yeah. I think that comes to mind another one of Lowe's quotes from about his teacher Hong when he said people would ask for advice and he'd say, eat more was one of his advices. It's just like
hey,
get bigger and try. And I think Lowe was a pretty skinny little guy when he started out. So that could have been that same advice
well,
Vince
and
gave you of like beef up
especially
a
if
little
you're
bit.
especially if you're training a lot.
So Lowe states that each of the Hong brothers got something a little bit different from Zhang. And thus, through investigating the methods of each brother, he was able to gain valuable insights. Lo feels that Hung Yishang's strength was his sticking and infighting ability, while the older brother Hung Yimen was best at open sparring from a distance. When he visited with Hung Yiwen, the Tai Chi specialist, he found his strong suit was in explaining the principles and theories of the art. So yeah, that speaks to what you were just saying. Especially Hung Yishang being the bigger, heavier guy had the sticking and infighting ability. So at close range, when you're the bigger, heavier guy at close range, hey, you smother the opponent and pound him. Whereas Hung Mien was better at open sparring from a distance and striking and moving, kind of.
Well, and if you think about that Rosho approach that Hung Shang used, it's all that hooking and kind of sticking and grabbing stuff where it's almost like you're just like a big snake or whatever wrapping around the person and they can't
Mm,
get away from you, where other approach is more, evasive, get out the
hit
way.
and run, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
That's how you avoid that snake and that
yeah. It's the
overwhelming
snake
effect.
and the mongoose, right? Like basically that idea, or the Chinese version is usually the snake and the crane, right? But you got one that's essentially stationary that can
Hmm.
wiggle a bunch and strike, and you got one that's kind of jumpy and flappy and springy, right? So those
Hmm.
two approaches, because sometimes you got to be that sort of undulating, squishy thing, and then sometimes you got to be that sharp, wow, and it both things are useful, right? So
Definitely. So between 1974 and 75, Lo also spent time visiting some of Zhang Jinfeng's other senior students, besides the three Hung brothers. Although many of the early students did not practice much anymore, they could still answer questions about Zhang's system and how it was taught. In talking with these early practitioners, Lo obtained information about the aspects of internal arts practice which Zhang emphasized in his teaching. After questioning numbers of Zhang's students, Lo discovered that Zhang taught his earlier students much differently than his later students. For the first 5 to 10 years Zhang was in Taiwan, he always expected to return to the mainland. During this period of time, Zhang developed short, intensive programs for the students so that they could learn as much as possible before he left. Later, when Zhang realized he was not going back to China, he taught more systematically. And that reminds me of what was said in Blurred Boundaries about that those early years in Taiwan when a lot of mainlanders were pretty much sure that they were going back. This was just a temporary retreat to Taiwan. They were once the USA got involved and MacArthur drop the bomb, they were going to turn around and finish off the communists and retake Beijing and get back to business.
Yeah.
But so he was teaching just in that sense of like, look, I'm going to give you some combat techniques, but I'm not going to drag you through the whole system because there's not enough time to do that.
Yeah, it's basically the like workshop approach versus the weekly class approach, right? When
Sure.
you when you think that you're someone's going to have to take what you're doing and they're going to have to work a lot of it out on their own, right? That you want to give them an outline, right? Where if you know you're going to have somebody weekly or whatever for a period of time, daily, hopefully, um, you can do things in a way where they don't have to know what's coming next. In a sense, you can take them, they can wait till they get to that point to know about that thing, right? Where if you're giving them the overview, it's like you might teach all five Xingyi elements in a weekend, so they at least they have the structure, right? But in a class, you could go, a year before you show them the second move, right?
Sure. Yeah, it's a whole different approach. And that slow simmering method is in Chinese martial arts, that's considered the best way. It takes longer, long and slow, but you get the best results. So,
Well, and that's why like sometimes the number of years somebody has trained with a teacher doesn't really match the number of hours that they trained with, that you could say, oh, I trained with somebody for, 20 years, but maybe you only saw them once a year, right? Versus if you're training with somebody for 10 years and you're seeing them twice a week, you got a lot more training than the guy who was doing it for the longer period of time, right? So
sure,
I don't know. It's just that's where I think um it's definitely a quality over quantity thing.
definitely.
Getting a teacher in their prime when they're like pumped and they're really wanting to teach something um is gonna, yeah, as a student you're gonna learn a lot more than
Yeah.
from somebody who's kind of over it or whatever and isn't really engaged in the process. They might have more to teach, but if they're not willing, if they're not in it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No, there's some luck involved in finding the right time and right place. There's no doubt about it.
it's the young master, right? That the guys you want to find to teach you martial arts are usually somewhere between 40 and 60, right? Because they've been doing it long enough to really get the training, and then but they're not so old that their bodies don't really work anymore, right? That
Exactly.
um
And
yes,
Lowe was finding these older guys who didn't train anymore and they were pretty over the hill, but they still could give him
right.
valuable insights into how Master Zhang did things back in the day.
Sure, there's a lot you can learn from the old masters, but you're not going to learn generally, they're not going to uh take you through the basics, as it were. They're
Right.
going to give you, once you can do it, they can tell you things and show you things that
Right. Right.
will enhance your view of the whole thing, but it's like rarely are they going to spend their time to go, oh no, your hand goes here.
Right. They
And
can't just do sets with you over and over like you're going to need to do. So Lowe also discovered that each of Zhang's students he talked with had developed what they had been taught differently. Even students of the same generation had interpreted what was taught to suit their body type and personal preferences. Just as the three Hong brothers had each got something a little different from Zhang, other students had also developed different strengths. Lowe stated that these differences were easiest to see when each individual demonstrated their rendition of the Houtian Baguazhang, the straight line forms. Through the process of visiting a wide variety of students who had studied with Zhang, Lowe was able to get a better feeling for his teaching method. So yeah, that's interesting. Like each of them had their take on the sets. And he mentions the 64 Hotian sets, which are the straight line forms of Gao style Bagua. They're little short 3 or 4 move sets that there's tons of them.
right,
And there, when Lowe teaches, he'll often have 2 or 3 variations of each set. He doesn't always teach them, but he has them sort of in his notebook. And I think that must have come from his time of visiting these other students of Zhang Zhenfeng. And sort of picking their brains and seeing the way Zhang taught it early on and then later on. And so each of the sets has variations that came about.
Sure. I mean, you can just look at like the versions that come from Luo De Xiu versus the ones that come from students of Hung Men, and you could tell they're basically the same, but
Hmm.
there's like stylistic differences.
Right. The same name and the same number
Same
of
order,
moves.
but but things might be a little bit rounder or a little bit shorter or a little bit longer, just
Right. And
like
yeah, the body flavor just totally different,
yeah,
and there's a wide variety. And I was lucky enough to train with some of the mainland teachers of Gao style from Tianjin, and
I'm sure
their
they had
way
to
of
be
doing it was totally different.
right.
Like
I mean,
they
yeah.
had a much shorter, more abrupt approach, whereas Lo always emphasized the long, stretched out version of everything. So you could see there was a totally as different
Yeah,
as
I
it could
mean,
be.
you can see it within, I mean, even within a school, right? I mean, people have just different body types and things, and they just like to do it a certain way. I mean, I can look at, I'm not going to name names, but I can look at most of my classmates and I look at a lot of things they do and go, what are you doing that for?
And I
You-
mean,
And I'm
Lowe's
sure
not
that,
so different from Kumar because sometimes he teaches it differently. He'll
right,
teach one version of set 4.2 and then teach it a little
exactly.
different a couple years later somewhere else. So you're like, well, wait, this is how he showed it to me.
Right. And
So you
that's
can't
where,
get too
yeah,
mad. Just like, okay,
the,
fine.
the acceptance of everybody's going to do it their own way is one of the more important things you got to do, but also one of the harder things to do because
Yeah.
there's that am I doing it right question, right? And so
Hmm.
when you see someone doing something different, your instinct is to say they're doing it wrong, I'm doing it right, versus we both just do our the way we like to do it. That it's okay to,
Right.
okay to be different,
And
So,
that's the challenge in all martial arts schools. But when it comes to Bagua, you don't have much choice because that's one of the hallmarks of Bagua is each generation adapts it to their own principles. I mean, adapts it to their own circumstances. The principles remain the
sure.
same, but that's how Dong Chuan taught it, in the late 1800s. So what are you going to do? Like he created the martial art to evolve and change. So you can't get too mad.
It's a lot of stuff. I think it's harder to see on a circle, right? So the thing that he said about you really noticed it more on with the
Mm,
O10 is because it's linear in more ways than one, right? And so you can see the differences in the movements where when things are kind of smushed together on a circle, it might be harder to see subtle little changes and different things like that. So I think
makes
this,
sense.
but it's also that piece that as Boggle gets more advanced, it gets less precise in the sense, right? The forms get less important and the change becomes the bigger thing.
Hmm.
People often say these arts are meditative. They're not meditative. They're introspective, right? It's like you have to look inside yourself to find these things that are stuck, but you're not meditating. You're not holding your mind on on a point or on a chi flow and circulating it the way you would do it in meditation. You're doing martial arts that use some of those same principles, but it isn't the same thing. It's like there's this active mind that has to be involved in it, and I think that's what you can only really get from experience, right? This is the esoteric part of these things.
Right. That's that internal part of internal martial arts. So Lo's thirst for Bagua knowledge did not stop with the Baguazhang of Zhang Feng. If he heard about anyone on the island of Taiwan teaching Bagua, he would go visit with them and ask questions. He also bought all of the books he could find on Bagua and devoured them. Looking at the condition of some of the books in Lo's library, it is evident that he must have read through them hundreds of times. Lo stated by the mid 70s that he had experience fighting in tournaments and had practiced the rough outline of the art. However, after 3 or 4 years of this training, he wanted to understand more about the finer details. Lowe stated that it is fairly easy to learn how to copy movements. However, if you do not understand how to look beyond the physical movements, it will be difficult to discover the finer points of the system. By studying books and asking questions of Baguazhang practitioners from various lineages and backgrounds, Luo was able to gain a better understanding of the art's finer points and broaden his knowledge of the system as a whole. In 1977, Luo went into the Navy. He said that while serving his tour of duty in the Navy, his job allowed him plenty of free time, and he filled that time with Bagojong practice.
Nice.
Yep, that sounds like him. It was also during his military stint that he met his second formal Bagojong teacher, Liu Chen. Liu Chen had been an early student of Shunji-kun and was living in Kaohsiung when Luo met him. Liu Chen and Shunji-kun were together later in Sun's life, as Sun died in Kaohsiung after the war. Luo De Xiu studied with Liu every weekend for 2 years. Because Liu was 90 years old already when Luo met him, he did not study the forms with Liu, but instead, Liu watched the Bagua that Luo was already practicing and helped him fill in the details and understand the concepts. Luo states that the most important thing he learned from Liu was how to see the concepts and principles of the Baguazhang system and look at how everything fits together in forming the whole. Liu filled in the missing pieces. Luo states that this knowledge has helped him tremendously in designing training programs for his students. So Luo was able to find a student of this guy who was already of an advanced age, who had learned from Sun Ji-kun in the mainland, and then Sun Ji-kun had actually lived with him in Taiwan after the war, even though he died only 1 or 2 years after the
It's almost the identical story to what Bruce with Leo Hung-jae with Ma Gui, right? Where you get a guy who's old, who lived with a guy who when he was old.
Right.
And so it's like, but that's the only way you're going to get back to that earlier generation.
That's part of Chinese martial arts is that intergenerational transmission and that connection, those links, that energy that's passed from one generation to the next and skip a generation to connect you to the heyday of the past. And the 1870s was the peak of Bagua. Yeah, well, these traditions die hard, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So we end this section of the article by saying that Luo returned to Taipei after leaving the Navy in 1980 and shared what he learned from his teacher in Kaohsiung with some of the other older classmates from Hongishang School. After his military tour of duty, Luo did not continue to study on a regular basis at Hong's Tangshidao School. However, he did stay in contact with Hong. In 1983, when the BBC filmed a special documentary, The Way of the Warrior, about Hong Yishang and his school, Luo De Xiu was the person Hong chose to demonstrate Baguazhang in the film.
Now that says a lot.
Right? And he looks pretty good on that film. That's one of the first exposures a lot of foreigners had to Bagua, and there was Luo doing it. And sure enough,
definitely doesn't look as smooth. I mean,
no, he's young, dude.
You can still see he's kind of a youngster, and he's
I'd chalk it up to being a little nervous too. He's just kind of like he's going as fast as he can, to show for the camera.
But I mean, it's just interesting to see. You can compare that to 20 years later, and he's just liquid, and it's like
so. Yeah, he's in his early 20s, and he's definitely a young firebrand. I'd love to see the tape off the cutting room floor from that film. Because you can tell they shot tons more stuff. And Hung Yi-men, the Bagua brother, was even there. They have some pictures of him off to the side, and
his little fisherman's cap.
It was and Hung Zihan tells the whole story of it in the book Blurred Boundaries, which again I can't recommend enough for that background about life in Taiwan. So now we're going to go on to the Patreon and continue our look at article from Taiwan Wulin magazine that was published in Chinese back in 2002, but we've got it translated here, so we've been breaking it down, and it's an article where Luo De Xiu talks about Zhang Junfeng and the school in a little more detail than he does here in Pa Kua Journal. So some of the same material, but it's a little bit of a different take. So we're going to keep unpacking that article in the Patreon if you want to check it out.
All right. Hey, folks, hope you enjoyed the episode. You can go to our Instagram, Facebook page, see images to go along with the episodes. And you can head over to the Patreon. You can join for $5 a month, and you can hear the bonus episode as well as our archive of other stuff. All right. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves and be well.